Hello and welcome back to Talking to the Void. Today is August 9th, 2023, and I'm going to be talking about Agatha Christie's story Curtain. Before I fully dive in, I just want to mention that this podcast is different from my previous two because it is completely scripted. After yesterday's extra rambly rant on Andor, I decided I wanted to try a full scripted version to see which one people like more. So please let me know your thoughts on this one, and that will inform my decisions about how to format my podcasts moving forward. Also, trigger warning for this podcast episode, there are mentions of suicide in the book that I will be discussing. If you're okay with that, stick around, and if not, you gotta do what's best for you. So my suggestion is to skip to another podcast episode. Now, let's talk about Curtain. Curtain is Agatha Christie's final story with the famous Belgian detective Hercule Poirot. That's my horrible French pronunciation. Hercule Poirot. Anyway. And it is a sequel to The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Both stories are incredibly well done, and if you haven't read them, please stop the podcast, go read them, and come back because there will be major spoilers coming. If you somehow don't care about spoilers for Agatha Christie's books, or you know the spoilers, hopefully because you've read the story and not just because you looked them up, and want to hear what I have to say, then keep listening. Let's get into it. The main thing I wanted to talk about from the story Curtain is big red spoiler alert! Hercule Poirot's death. Because Curtain is the final story featuring Poirot, and Poirot is pretty old by this point, it makes sense to kill the character off in the finale. However, I take issue with how they go about it, but first, context. The story takes place at the famous Styles court where The Mysterious Affair at Styles took place. The narrator, retired Captain Arthur Hastings, is staying at this house and encounters his old friend Hercule Poirot. Poirot is there because he believes a killer is staying at the house, a killer who is responsible for 5 different murders but has somehow avoided prosecution, and he wants to catch this person. During their stay, one of the characters, Colonel Luttrell, shoots his wife by accident. Hastings debates poisoning a character he thinks is too close to his daughter, and Mrs. Franklin, the invalid wife of a famous doctor, dies by poison, but her death is ruled a suicide. After much drama, another character, Stephen Norton, is found dead, shot in the head, and his death is ruled a suicide, and Poirot dies in the same night from a heart attack. 4 months after Poirot's death, Hastings receives a letter that Poirot wrote before his passing, which explains everything. Stephen Norton, the man who was shot in the head, was the killer. His method of killing, however, was unique because he convinced people to do the killing themselves. For example, Colonel Luttrell shot his wife because of an argument they had earlier in the day, but the idea to kill her was planted by Stephen Norton. When Hastings was debating poisoning the man he thought was too close to his daughter, that idea was also subtly prompted by Norton. And then finally, the poisoning death that was ruled a suicide was actually a failed murder attempt. Mrs. Franklin was attempting to poison her husband, an idea also planted by Norton, but she accidentally poisoned herself because Hastings unintentionally switched some coffee cups around by rotating this turning table that the cups were on. Because of Norton's insidious method of committing murders, that is, indirectly, he could never truly be brought to justice. How can you prove that somebody convinces other people to commit murder? So Poirot took matters into his own hands, killed Norton himself, and then didn't take his heart medication, resulting in him having a heart attack. In Poirot's own words, "I have moved the amyl nitrite ampoules away from my bed. I prefer to leave myself in the hands of le bon Dieu. May his punishment or his mercy be swift." So essentially, Poirot's story ends with him taking justice into his own hands when justice cannot be fulfilled by the law, which is a rather poetic, albeit tragic, ending to his story. I will admit that when I first read the story, I didn't like it. I still don't like it, but I have an appreciation for it now. I think that this is, in ways, a fitting ending for Poirot, since his story with Hastings ends in the same place that it began, and he becomes the arbiter of justice where the legal system fails. In essence, his final moments were also his most Poirot moments. However, I find it depressing that he stoops to committing murder and also basically kills himself in the end. So, I did what every writer does and challenged myself to come up with a better final story for Poirot with a better or at least less depressing ending for such a beloved character. It would be fun to write it, and maybe after I finish recording this episode of my podcast, I'll start working on it, but currently I just have a general outline and that's what I'm going to share now. I like the fact that Poirot's last case with Hastings occurs in the same location as their first case together. That's some beautiful literary symmetry. I also like the idea of a killer who can never truly be brought to justice because they convince other people to kill each other rather than do the dirty work themselves. This is a neat premise. However, instead of having Poirot take matters into his own hands and kill the killer himself, I think it would be far more interesting if he knew that he was going to be killed and instead solved the case before his death, leaving behind all the clues Hastings would need to bring the killer to justice and put them away. This is admittedly similar to what already happens, but without Poirot committing both murder and basically suicide, thus making it less depressing. An additional twist that I think would be interesting is the killer destroying the evidence Poirot left behind so that they couldn't be brought to justice, and a confrontation between Hastings and the killer in which Hastings is forced to kill the killer in self-defense, thus closing the case and seeing that justice is brought about in some form without making Hastings a guilty party as well. It would also be neat if Hastings killed the killer in self-defense before finding the evidence or even suspecting that person, then feeling terrible about their death, only to later find the evidence from Poirot that they were the killer all along. Just a couple other things that could make Poirot's final case more interesting are the reappearance of other characters from stories featuring Poirot, such as Ariadne Oliver, for example, although she's not personally a favorite of mine, or characters from other Agatha Christie books like Miss Marple or Tommy and Tuppence Beresford, as well as more prominent callbacks to The Mysterious Affair at Styles, since these two stories are the bookends of Poirot's career as we know it. Anyway, those are my main thoughts on the book. There's definitely a lot more to be said on Curtain, but I think I'm going to leave it here. This was a far shorter podcast than I expected it to be, because I felt like I did a lot of writing, but this whole thing is probably going to be maybe 7 minutes. But anyway, please let me know your thoughts on this scripted format for the podcast. Did you like it more because it was less rambly? Was it not as fun because you don't get my random comments along the way? And also tell me what you think about the book and my rewrite suggestions. I'd love to hear it. Anyway, take care. Sending you all the love.